Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. The International Monetary Fund launched formal bailout talks with Pakistan on Thursday, and IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde said she would require absolute transparency on Pakistan's debts, including those owed to China. She said such disclosures were necessary to determine the debt sustainability of countries seeking IMF loans. The requirements are likely to shine a spotlight on the extent, composition and terms of Pakistan's debts to China for infrastructure projects as part of Beijing's massive Belt and Road building program. The United States has criticized China's infrastructure lending, warning that it has saddled some developing countries with debts that they cannot afford to repay. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said that there would be no rationale for an IMF bailout of Pakistan that pays off Chinese loans. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze IMF's scrutiny for Pakistan. Joining me on the program today are Prabhu Dayal, former ambassador, Professor Sreeram Chaulia, Dean, Jindal School of International Studies, and Saikat Datta, South Asia editor, Asia Times. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. Prime Minister Imran Khan first slammed the IMF and has now sought a bailout. Why the change?
Well, frankly, he may have slammed the IMF, but Pakistan has been correctly described as an IMF addict. Since 1980, they have received 14 IMF bailouts, and some of them of a considerable amount of money. In 2008, for instance, they got an IMF bailout package, $7.6 billion. Again, in 2013, they got another such bailout package of $6.6 billion. So the IMF has begun to wonder where all this money is going, and the IMF was keen to scrutinize the Pakistani finances before it doled out any more money. The Pakistanis were aware of it, so they were first of all not too keen to go to the IMF. In fact, Prime Minister Imran Khan went to Saudi Arabia and the UAE to seek a loan. And in fact, the advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, the advisor's name is Razak Dawood, has gone on record as saying that it was an awful experience to go begging to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis apparently put very tough conditions. I understand that they told the Pakistanis they would get money only if they are prepared to fight alongside the Saudi forces and the UAE forces in their war against the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen. So this was something that the Pakistanis were not prepared to accept, because this would bring the Shia-Sunni conflict right into Pakistan, because there is an ongoing friction between the Shiite minority and the Sunni majority. And if the Pakistanis were to join the Saudi and UAE forces, then surely the Shia-Sunni conflict would come right into Pakistan. So very reluctantly, they have agreed to, seek the IMF aid, and the Americans are very concerned that this money which they get would be used to pay off the Chinese loans. We have other concerns, because all money which comes to Pakistan gets diverted one way or the other to the army, but the army sucks away a lot of the finances coming into Pakistan. And then this money is very often, to a great extent, used against us, because the army is the greatest patron of the terrorist groups which operate from Pakistani soil against India. So we have our own concerns. Money coming to Pakistan is bound to end up in the wrong hands, and we have our concerns. It doesn't really strengthen the Pakistani infrastructure. You know that despite all the IMF bailouts, the pathetic state of the infrastructure in Pakistan is known to all.
Right.
So we have our concerns. The Americans have their concerns. Both are very well founded. And I think the IMF must look through the Pakistani finances very, very properly. In fact, it should not give them any assistance in the form that the Pakistanis are asking. The Pakistanis are believed to be wanting in excess of $8 billion, $8 to $10 billion.
Yeah.
This sort of money is ridiculously high, and certainly, going by their track record, the Pakistanis don't deserve it.
Taking a cue from what the ambassador just said, Professor, how concerned should India be, do you think? More so because Everyone's calling Imran Khan a puppet in the hands of the ISI and the Pakistani army.
Frank, the share of the federal budget in Pakistan goes to the military anywhere between 50 to 75%. And it's mostly unaccountable and nobody even dares to ask. And you're right that Imran Khan, because he's beholden to the military, cannot even challenge that. So what is the scope for reforms? I mean, the IMF always says when we bail out a country, especially a serial debtor like Pakistan, the thing they insist upon are reforms. And number one is cutting state spending, and number two, greater transparency in government projects. Number three, improving the tax collection. The tax to GDP ratio of Pakistan is like 10%.
10%, yeah.
It's one of the lowest in the world. For relative comparison, India is at least 21%. We are not great, but relatively far better. So if you look at these conditions and the reform requirements, the military is the biggest hurdle to, as Ambassador was saying, to actually improving their lot and to get going in terms of a fast growth trajectory, which they lack. But Imran Khan is unable to actually tackle this big structural obstacle because he's part of that establishment. He is not an anti-establishment figure who represents the society per se. We all know how he came to power. So the biggest problem I think they have is the money going down the drain frequently and no major reforms happening. You look at classic sectors of Pakistan that had promise, for example, to improve export revenues and generate wealth and jobs for the people. Textiles, textbook case where at one time they were actually had more potential and capacity for production export than Bangladesh. Today Bangladesh left them far behind, you see. So the governance deficit is so deep, and this Naya Pakistan of Imran Khan is proving out to be no different from any of the older ones. So they are simply unable, it's like they're caught in a kind of a vicious cycle. So 13th bailout, and then there will be more, and they are saying that this is going to be the last. But the point is, the Chinese on the other hand, or the Saudi or UAE, have very much more political conditions, which will be suicidal for Imran Khan to take. So therefore, after all the bravado and the chutzpah that he tried to say, in fact he claimed that IMF bailout is suicide, but now he's committing that suicide because he has no option. As Ambassador said, the Saudi want them to join an anti-Iranian movement. The Chinese already have actually worsened the economic situation. A lot of the current account deficit in Pakistan, for example, which is the reason for this macroeconomic crisis and the bailout, is on account of importing the machinery and equipment from the Chinese for Belt and Road projects. They would not be having such a massive deficit and where they can't even cover 2 months of imports right now. So in a way, if they had to go back to China and fall back on them, the conditionalities and the complete debt trap would have worsened and would have led to complete sale of sovereignty of the country. So on the other hand, the Saudi and UAE were not there, and therefore they had no other option but to go back hat in hand. So for all the bluster during election time of Imran Khan, it turns out that he has no good options. And frankly, even after receiving the money, we are going to see the same show over and over again, which is this vicious cycle.
Okay. Is the vicious cycle going to break with the 13th IMF bailout, Saikat Datta, or do you believe that is going to continue?
I don't think that the bailout is going to make any change. For example, if you look at what the advisor to the Prime Minister, Mr. Dawood, has said, he first criticized the IMF, then they went out and then he issued a statement saying that the earlier government had created such a mess with CPEC that we therefore need to now go to IMF. So you see, there's a whole bunch of contradictions that are coming out. And I think, and one of my colleagues on the panel just mentioned, the defense budget this time, despite such a massive economic crisis, has actually gone up by almost 25% as compared to last year. So there is a huge black hole which is continuing to consume more and more money. And then whatever bailout the Chinese talk about, it's basically the Chinese are going to take money from one pocket and transfer it to another pocket in the name of BRI or CPEC, with Pakistan holding the can because they'll have to pay the interest on this transfer of money from one pocket to the other. So there's no way that they'll be able to break out of this vicious cycle. And a new complexity is that the IMF wants details of so far secretive loans that China has given in the name of CPEC and BRI. And if that comes out, that puts China in a difficult position. And as we just discussed, the Saudis were thinking at some point of participating in CPEC by putting up an oil refinery in Gwadar, but they have pulled out. And first, Imran Khan was very critical of the Saudis, then he went to the Saudis, and then he came back, and now the Saudis are not going to be part of the deal. So it's in an impossible situation right now, and I don't think that's going to change.
You know, Ambassador, it's a very difficult situation for Imran Khan to be in at this point in time also, isn't it? Because, you know, your traditional allies are deserting you. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates have said that we really can't help you unless these strict conditions are met. On the other hand, you have China too, who, you know, which comes with its own set of conditions. So where does this leave Imran Khan really?
You're right, he's in a very tight spot. He's going early next month on his first visit to China as Prime Minister. And surely he's going to ask for the scaling down of some projects, or at least focusing on projects which generate more employment. I don't know how willing the Chinese would be to restructure the kind of project management that they have been having in mind. But I think that unless Pakistan changes the manner in which it has been oriented into thinking, unless it becomes a normal state, it's not going to be able to get out of this economic mess. It's a country where the army is pampered beyond any reasonable limits. The army in Pakistan holds total sway. It has full control over everything that it wants to. I'm sure that the Pakistanis themselves are aware of the fact that the country's resources are being diverted towards keeping the army happy, much more than they ought to be. And the loser ultimately is the common man, because what suffers are the needs of the common man. The last time that the Pakistanis restructured, and this I'm quoting the former Pakistani Deputy Chief of the Planning Commission, Nadeem ul Haq. He said that the sectors which suffered were the public transport sector, the railways, all these which meet the needs of the common man. There was no cut on the army because the army comes forward as the great defender of Pakistan. Really speaking, the army has budgets heads like transport and rations and all that, and ammunition and arms. A lot of money which is given to the army is funneled to the terror groups, and the terror groups act against India and against Afghanistan. This is all too well known. So it's high time that the IMF takes a good hard look at the army's budget, where the money which is being given through the Pakistani budget to the army, how is it being utilized? Of course, it's very difficult to pinpoint the diversion of resources because they are all merged into various general heads like transport and arms and ammunition. But unless the Pakistani government can rein in the army, the state of their economy is going to keep going down, and the world will keep looking askance at how things continue to go wrong in Pakistan.
Sure. You know, Professor, what are the conditions really as far as this IMF bailout is concerned? Can these conditions be met? Because in the past, Pakistan has not met many of these conditions. And also, what's going to change really?
I think, Frank, one of the things apart from, curbing excessive welfare policies. Already, Imran Khan, who said that he will set up an Islamic welfare society, has now backtracked and is now saying we have to implement austerity in order to balance the books. So which means the poor who live on handouts will not get those. On the other hand, the IMF would say that you need to tax the richest corporations. And he cannot do that because most of these are controlled by foundations and trusts which have got retired military generals sitting on them. So what do you get then? He has, kind of a moribund industry. The agriculture sector, you still have feudal, domination in many parts where there's not enough production or enough land ownership that can lead to profit and export. So they are stuck with these things. And I think usually when you look at a country like, for example, Argentina, that's another case that has frequently received IMF bailouts historically and has mismanaged its economy. The one and only, the crux of the matter is poor governance and lack of accountability. And the elites usually get away and they still live luxurious lives. But the gap with the middle and the working class is massive. So therefore, they are set up, in fact, and that feeds into the radicalization and the jihadist culture as well, because in the absence of any opportunities, most of the youth, even in the Punjab province, now not to mention the Balochistan and the Khyber, are being attracted to these so-called charities that are funded from the Gulf and which become funnels to join sectarian or large-scale jihadist groups to wreak havoc in the region. So one of the things that I think the IMF is also looking for, indirectly via the US, although the IMF itself will not talk about it, is this problem, this interference in affairs of Afghanistan and India. I think the Americans have made very clear behind the scenes that this time, the bailout, if it goes up to 12 billion, will include unspoken conditionalities of restraining this jihadist menace. And we have been talking about how the US could crack down on for a long time. But I think this time they may have more leverage, simply because, as we've discussed, Imran Khan has very little wriggle room. Although I must say that the Pakistani military tends to be irrational, and in fact Christine Fair has written a book about it, saying that here is a military that keeps losing wars to India, that keeps bleeding its own society, that knows it's working against its own best national interests, and still perseveres and still commands and still uses propaganda to whip up Pakistani nationalism. So you have a situation where there will be restraints, I think, placed on their nefarious activities in the region. And in that sense, it's a good news for India if they get an IMF bailout, because we would want all levers of pressure to be applied on them, not just for handing over, masterminds like Hafiz Saeed, but at the lower level on the ground, to stop this infiltration business for which Pakistan has become the world's #1, expert. Both infiltration into Afghanistan by Taliban and by the Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba and Hizbul Mujahideen into Kashmir, Indian Kashmir. So I think if that kind of outcome ultimately comes about, we should be quite pleased with. Although we must say, as I said, the caveat is that the irrationality of the Pakistani military is such. Remember, they have had prime ministers in the past who said that we will eat grass, but we will still acquire nuclear weapons in order to attain parity with the Indians. So if it's that kind of mindset, the jihadist mindset that we have to fight what they consider to be a Hindu India, I think it's a lost cause for them.
All right. That having been said, Saikat, Datta, at the end of the day, the US is a major shareholder as far as the IMF is concerned, and Mike Pompeo has gone on record and said, we will be watching what the IMF does. So does an IMF bailout in the long run help the region on the whole?
See, as we said, taking a loan from the IMF is only a short-term, very limited intervention, and basically an emergency measure. It will have no long-term effect for the simple reason, as my co-panelists have been saying, Pakistan is in a mess of its own. Let's also look at some figures. Like, some speculation is that if the IMF loans kick in, immediately about 1.2 to 2 million jobs might get lost because of the austerity measures that the government might have to do. For a country of the size of Pakistan, that's a massive hit. Also look what has happened ever since Chabahar came up. The trade associations in Pakistan have lost almost 70% of the business, because most of the trade going into Afghanistan has now been diverted to other regions and is not going through Pakistan, so that has been lost. And as we have seen, the military, look at what the military did. On the 10th of October, look at who they appointed as the DG-ISI, a man called Lieutenant General Asim Munir, who's known as a hardline, who's known as deeply religious, etc. So the military is giving you constantly signals that it's not going to change. And it's the military which controls Pakistan. And unless and until the military changes, Pakistan will not change. So any kind of bailout that comes in will only dig Pakistan into a deeper black hole. And that, unfortunately, is even a IMF bailout will look like.
Right. Taking the discussion forward now, CPEC was mentioned on a few occasions. Ambassador, is CPEC the chief trigger behind the economic crisis in Pakistan, do you think?
You're right. CPEC has led to the impression that Pakistan's infrastructure is going to be developed, and therefore the Chinese loans are going to be very helpful. The fact of the matter is that the Chinese loans have sunk Pakistan even deeper into debt. At this juncture, I'd like to differ slightly with my co-panelist, Dr. Sreeram, who said that in a way it's good that Pakistan would get an IMF bailout package, because then the IMF would be able to monitor and look closely at where the money is going. And the Americans would be putting pressure in that regard. The Americans are only interested in ensuring that Pakistani terror groups do not act in Afghanistan. Frankly, the Americans are not terribly bothered about what the Pakistani terror groups do vis-a-vis India. That is our battle, and we have to sort it out. And for this reason, because we will not be able to sit and monitor where the funds are being diverted, funds which come as part of the IMF bailout package, therefore, we should oppose this bailout package tooth and nail. This is not going to be good for us, this package, because even if a small part of it is diverted for activities against India, still it is going to hurt us. Now, as far as the CPEC issue is concerned, look at what happened in Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankans were not able to pay debts. I think they had debts to the tune of about $6 billion, and they have been forced to give that Hampantota base port for a 99-year-old lease, 99-year long lease. The Pakistanis are being forced into a corner by the Chinese, where they will have to give up more and more in terms of their sovereignty. The Chinese wanted to have a direct say, in fact, a control over running that part of the railway which they are financing, and the Pakistanis are not happy doing that. The Pakistanis must know that the more debt that they take from the Chinese, the more their sovereignty will be compromised. The real future for Pakistan lies as being a responsible member of the fraternity of nations in South Asia. We have been advocating consistently that the Chinese should have normalized relations with all the other countries of South Asia. They should have normal trade. They should have they should help to create a normal fraternity. In fact, when the last SAARC summit was held in Islamabad, I think it was in 2003, the Pakistanis were very keen that a South Asian agreement on free trade, or SAFTA, should be signed. And we all signed it. All the other countries ratified it, but Pakistan has not ratified it, with the result that the SAFTA agreement has not become operational. Pakistan should change its tactics. It should change track and become a normal society where terrorism is not the be-all and end-all of its objectives, that rather the welfare of its people should matter, and that welfare will come about only when it learns to stand on its own feet, not go with begging bowls all over the place, and look at those things which are becoming a drain on its finances, and surely its abatement of terrorism is right there at the top of the list.
Right. You know, Professor, talking about trade, we've obviously found other ways to get to Afghanistan, Iran and beyond. But do you believe that Pakistan should open up the borders for trade really with India, because that will definitely help their economy?
Well, the motor vehicles agreement of SAARC has been stalled for a long time because of this one objector. All the other SAARC countries are on board for seamless connectivity through land as well as waterways. As you know, we are doing our own parallel, small group connectivity projects of BBIN with Bhutan, Bangladesh and Nepal. Then there is BIMSTEC, and we are going ahead. But ideally, we would like our vehicles to be able to crisscross the Pakistani territory to reach Afghanistan and beyond. But they, we know that that's the mindset, the phobia they have of being somehow inundated or by what they consider to be Indian hegemony is so strong and is so deeply rooted that they have been force-fed the narrative that we can become slaves of China through CPEC or through Belt and Road, but we will not accept any kind of anything less than equality with the Indians. And that is, I think, the psychological barrier that's holding them back. Because if they actually trade with us, people often cite, for example, sugar. Pakistan has got a huge, sugar production, but they would rather be able to trade with us rather than selling it to some Gulf countries which are far away. In terms of trade depends also on the cost of transport, and it's a rational thing for them to work with their neighbors. But that's lacking this rationality. What has happened is they have been hacking at their own feet with the sole objective of somehow, it's like cut my nose to spite your face. And that's always been that obsession for somehow preventing India from rising. And in fact, the CPEC must be also put in that context, Frank, for our audiences. Why has China historically, not just with CPEC, but even before, always been the so-called all-weather ally of Pakistan? They have this joint objective of preventing or hemming down India and tying it down in the region so it doesn't become an equal of China or a great power. So Pakistan has played this role, and in fact it has been shameless about relying on the Chinese handouts for a long time. CPEC is the latest form of it. But the point is, if they could actually develop some kind of a democratic system where there is civilian accountability and where people actually ask about what are the costs we are losing for not being fully part of SAFTA, for example. That's when because usually the debate in Pakistan, even on the MFN status for India, for example, for trade, is always surrounding the chambers of commerce and some elite business people.
Right.
And that's the lack of democracy. If you solve that, I think they have fixed more or less the whole problem. There's no debt issue then.
All right. Closing comment now from Saikat, Datta, on what does the future hold for Pakistan really? More of this, or do you believe that it's going to bounce back? Because at the end of the day, if Pakistan collapses, it's going to have ramifications for the rest of the region as well.
See, I was in a track tour with the Pakistanis just about a month ago, and every interlocutor there, while they continue to talk about the traditional positions that they have on issues like terrorism or Kashmir, etc., underlying all that was this big fear that what happens if the economy tanks. And then everything that they say, whether it is on Kashmir or, their solidarity with the so-called Kashmiri brothers, etc., all that comes to a naught if they don't have an economy to talk about. And today, what is happening is, let's also not forget that Pakistan is a nuclear state. And if there is any destabilization of the regime or of the structures there, then that will have tremendous and massive ramifications for the whole region. And not just the region, I think globally these will have ramifications. I mean, today Pakistan is also in possession of what we understand as tactical nukes. And if suddenly they fall into the wrong hands, then America is not too far from a dirty bomb. So where will you go if this kind of an economic crisis continues to happen? And that's a serious question, no longer just for the region, but I think for the whole global order as we understand it.
Yes, Ambassador.
Well, frankly, instead of giving Pakistan any more bailouts, the IMF should simply hold up a mirror for Pakistan to see itself. Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves are now about $8.3 billion, which is less than the foreign exchange reserves of Nepal, Myanmar and Sri Lanka, which are much smaller countries. Its foreign exchange reserves are only slightly more than those of Guatemala and Costa Rica. So this itself should illustrate to the Pakistanis the gross mismanagement of money which is going on in their country. The Pakistani people realize that resources are being diverted to the wrong purposes, for the wrong purposes, except that they are helpless. The IMF should be able to give the Pakistanis a few lessons in how they should manage their money better instead of giving it more doles and more bailouts.
10 seconds, only 10 seconds, Professor. Yeah.
Self-criticism is the way to reform and to improve yourself. Imran Khan has been lashing against the West and against India and all these, so-called, enemies of the Pakistani Qawm. I think they need to look inwards, and that's the starting point for them to be on the better track.
All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India as well. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'd like to hear from you as well. Do share your feedback and suggestions with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles @FRP09 and @Rajya Sabha TV. That's it from me. See you again next time.